In this segment, I'm going to be demonstrating the capture for HDR using a mirrorless camera. Now, I recognize that the slides, throughout the course, they were actually showing the live view of a Canon 6D, which is a digital SLR. And certainly the procedure for capturing for HDR using a DSLR is pretty straightforward. But we're faced with mirrorless cameras these days, and I really wanted to take a few minutes to give you a demonstration of setting up for and capturing for HDR using a mirrorless camera. I'm trying to illustrate here that the procedure that I've outlined in this course is pretty much the same whether it's a DSLR or it's a mirrorless camera. And so I wanted to take a few minutes and step you through the process of capturing with a mirrorless camera. Now, I happen to have here a Sony a6000, a wonderful mirrorless camera. I'm not going to be discarding my Canon 6D anytime soon, but I also found that the Sony a6000 is a wonderful camera, and I use the a6000 for HDR photography too, and it's really not a whole lot different than a DSLR. The difference is that your settings and your interaction with the camera is different, but the procedure, the methods are pretty much the same in a mirrorless camera when shooting for HDR as a digital SLR. So to my right here, I have an LCD monitor that is showing the live view of the a6000, which is right in front of me, and then I have another camera that's shooting from a different angle. So we're gonna switch over to the other camera now, and let's take a look at setting up and performing an HDR field capture using the Sony a6000 mirrorless camera. All right, so now we are in the position here. I have the a6000 on a tripod. Here is the live view on a monitor. This is so that you can see it. What you're seeing on this monitor is exactly what you would see on the LCD of the camera itself. So there's nothing different about this other than it's bigger so that I can point to and we can talk about the various settings. Now, let's start with a kind of a review of the settings that I currently have. You'll notice that I'm shooting in Aperture Priority. That's where I prefer to be. I prefer to be in Aperture Priority when it comes to HDR capture, because the camera will actually be taking care of the shutter speed, and I will decide the focal point, the aperture. And I've happened to choose an f11 here because that's just what I wanted to do. All right, that's part of your composition. You get to decide that, whereas with the camera, you allow the camera to be an Aperture Priority and it will determine the shutter speed. You'll note here that I'm shooting in RAW, and we've talked about that in this course. When I'm shooting in RAW, I have a much better chance of getting the highest possible quality from the output of my camera, and which is going to serve me very, very well when I'm in the post-processing and the tone mapping process. You'll notice here I have the camera set up for spot metering, and you'll also notice that I have it set up for ISO 100. All right. And you probably recognize some of these settings from when we went through previous segments. We were talking about the various settings that are important for HDR photography. Now, what I'm doing is I'm pointing my camera at two pieces of cardboard. One is black and one is white. And I'm doing this so that I can illustrate more clearly the behavior of the histogram. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is just dial this in so that I get a nice even black and white side that I can use to illustrate setting this mirrorless camera up for HDR capture. All right, now the first thing I'm going to do is go to a different display right here, because this particular display will allow us to see everything that we need to know about setting this camera up. All right, I'm going to put that back into 0 compensation. This is my compensation meter scale. That's going to be important to us. We're going to pay a lot of attention to that. This here is the histogram. That's the dark side, all right, or the shadow side. This is the white side or the highlight side. All right, just like we've talked about in this course. Here's my F11, aperture priority. The camera is determining the shutter speed at this particular exposure compensation, which is 0. All right, and over here there's more settings. I am in single capture mode right now, so I am not set up for bracket just yet. There's my RAW, and so I'm in pretty good shape. This is my starting point. Now, if you recall in the course, we had talked about one of the steps in setting up for an HDR capture is to determine if you have, at what meter point you have clipping that's occurring on the highlight side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial that exposure compensation up, all right, right there. And now you see on the highlight side of the histogram, I am beginning to have clipping occurring right here on the highlight side. And I'm at a +2 exposure compensation. Now, if you recall from the previous segments of the course, the idea is we find this point at which clipping begins, we remember that, and that is the first step of setting up for an HDR capture. Now, if you recall, the next step was to determine on the shadow side where we start to have clipping on the shadow side. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dial down the exposure compensation, and there we go. Now you'll note there that there is clipping is beginning to occur on the shadow side, and I am at -1 exposure compensation. This is 0, that's -1. All right, so I'm going to put that in my head, and so now I know that I have exposure settings between -1 and, as you recall, between +2. All right? So my 2 steps have been completed. I've determined the exposure compensation point for no clipping on the highlight side, and I've determined my exposure compensation point for no clipping on the shadow side. All right, that's the first 2 steps are done. Fairly easy to do. All right, then if you recall, the next step was to put the exposure compensation back in the middle, which I'm approximating as 0.7, +0.7. All right, and you'll notice now the histogram, nice and clean, no clipping on the highlight, no clipping on the shadow. So I've got a nice, evenly centered histogram reading, no clipping. And I am in the center position of the exposure compensation, center with respect to, if you recall, the +2 and the -1, which I determined is where clipping is not occurring. I'm not talking about the center of the scale. I'm talking about the center of the two readings that I took, which is approximately that. It could be 1. All right, it's approximately, you know, somewhere in that area. That's the center of my two readings. All right, now I'm back in the center. That's the third step. First step, second step, third step, go back in the center. Now we're in good shape. Now we can go set up for bracketing. So what I'm going to do is, all right, my function key, select. I'm going to go down here to continuous bracket. And what the camera is doing right here is it's giving me a 2 EV difference over 3 images. All right, that happens to be okay, but I certainly have some control of that. I can make that 1 EV. Now that's 1 EV under to the negative, under the 0, the center position, and that's 1 EV over the center position. That's the center position that I chose. All right, and the 2 EVs, that's 2 under, 2 over, 3 under, 3 over. We are talking about 3 image capture. But I'm going to pick 2 because 2 is going to be very appropriate, and I'll show you why. If I go back to my display, now you'll notice that I have my bracketing set up. There's my position, my center position. There's the 2 under, there's the 2 over. All right. Now, if you recall, I had the highlight side, I had a metered exposure compensation of 2. Well, this particular bracket sequence is going to put me a little bit over that, and that's okay. As long as I don't have clipping, that's okay. Now you remember that I had a -1, which was my metered position for when I determined if there was clipping on the shadow side. Now you notice that was -1, but you notice that my bracket here is going to give me a little bit further. That's okay, as long as I don't have clipping. I'm okay. And I am shooting in RAW, so these values don't have to be totally, absolutely precise. Anyway, I'm in good position. Now, do you notice here that when I set up the bracket and I went back here, that the camera respected my center position? That's why that step is in there. All right, determine your meter position for no clipping on the highlight, step 1. Determine no clipping on the shadows, step 2. Put it back to the center point, step 3. And then set up the bracket, step 4. And you'll notice that when I came back here, the camera is respecting my center position. If the camera did something crazy like that, well, or it did something like that, I mean, that's not going to work for me at all, because I know that I have no clipping up here on 2, but I'm way under. That's going to be an underexposed image. That's going to be a failed capture. All right, so I'm going to get back right here. That's my center position. I'm in good shape. At this point, I can go ahead and shoot my bracket. Let's try it. Press the shutter button. All right, and it did it, and it's done. It comes back here, all set. Everything's the same. And if I wanted to, I could certainly go set up another bracket and do another HDR shot, or I can simply go back to my single capture, framed capture. So at this point, I'm going to switch back to the main monitor, and we're going to wrap this demonstration up. So there you go. So this was a demonstration of setting up the exposure bracket for an HDR capture. In this case, it was a 3-shot exposure bracket where I did 2 EVs over my center position and 2 EVs under my center position, which gave me all of the capture of all of the light levels within this scene. So you'll notice here that it really wasn't a big deal. I still followed the same procedure that I've been teaching here in this course, where you will you'll set your exposure compensation wheel so that you have no clipping on the highlight side of the histogram. Then you use the exposure compensation to determine the stops or the EVs where you have no clipping on the shadow side. And then in the next step, you'll put your exposure compensation setting back to the middle meaning the difference between your EV reading, your stops reading, for the no clipping on the highlight and the no clipping on the shadow. That's what I mean by the middle. So that's step number 3. You put your exposure compensation back to the middle. Step number 4, you go in and you set up your AEB, your automatic exposure bracket. And then step number 5, you hit the trigger button and you shoot your sequence. And the camera takes care of, in this particular example, shooting your 3 bracketed capture sequence. All right, so it's really pretty much the same with a mirrorless camera as with a DSLR. So I hope that this has been a valuable demonstration. If nothing else, it gave you some confidence that a mirrorless camera is perfectly suitable for high dynamic range photography. And I hope it's also given you an opportunity to see everything in practice using a live camera, where it really comes down to 4, maybe 5 steps. Highlight, determine the highlight clipping, determine the shadow clipping, put the exposure compensation back in the middle, set up your AEB, and shoot. And with shoot being number 5, so that probably doesn't even need to count as a step. Anyway, HDR photography is a lot of fun. It does not need to be difficult. It's just a matter of understanding that what you're trying to do is to come back from the field with enough exposures where you don't have any clipping, where between all of your exposures you have captured all of the light levels in that particular scene. And then you move into tone mapping, where you merge these together. You then do some tone mapping, and you work towards some remarkable and some stunning images. As a matter of fact, that brings us to the point where we can actually begin now exploring and learning tone mapping. So, I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. I'll see you in the next segment when we will begin to discuss tone mapping. I'll see you there.